Thank you everyone for joining our webinar. This is our second in the Coalition for More Responsible Transportation's webinar series. We're so happy that you can join us. Next slide, James. James, if you're able to advance the slide, that would be great. Perfect. Oh, one back. There we go. Awesome. Tech problems. Welcome to our webinar. So this is our second transportation webinar in this series. And today's topic is about how highway expansions undermine multimodal transportation and especially public transit. And so we know a lot of advocates are really well versed on highway pieces or on transit. And so the hope here is to come out with an understanding of how the two are interrelated. And this is, as I mentioned, hosted by the Coalition for More Responsible Transportation. Our vision for transportation in Wisconsin is that Wisconsinites deserve an effective, convenient, and clean transportation system that connects everyone to the places they want and need to go. The state's transportation policies should reflect Wisconsinites' needs and focus on improving quality of life, creating healthier, happier communities, and advancing Wisconsin toward a transportation system that benefits all people in our state. On the screen now, I have some photos of past actions that our coalition has put together. So on the top, there's a press conference from when we were able to halt the I-94 expansion project in Milwaukee. To the right of that is a picture from our 2016 Arrive Together Summit, and you'll see a couple hundred people in a room around round tables. On the bottom left is a group of us who gathered for a strategy retreat in Portage. On the bottom right is a group of advocates in Wausau who marched for transit in one of their local parades. As I mentioned, we hope that you'll join us for future webinars if you enjoy this one. Our two that are scheduled up and coming, we are doing these every 3 weeks. So June 18th, we're talking about the Last Mile Challenge in Wisconsin. And July 9th, we're talking about transportation and racial justice. Before we dive into our excellent speakers that we have, I want to give a little bit of information about Zoom. So all of you who are attending, you're in attendee mode, so we won't be able to see your video or hear you, but you can ask questions in the Q&A function. That should default to the bottom of your screen. So if you scroll your mouse over your screen, a bar should appear. It defaults to the bottom and you can type questions in there. Please do add questions. We'll have time at the end for all of our presenters to answer questions. And then if you submitted questions ahead of time, we hopefully will get to several of those as well as we have time for. So I'm happy to introduce our speakers. So I should have introduced myself before. This is Cassie Steiner. I'm the campaign coordinator with the Sierra Club John Muir chapter. That's the statewide branch of Sierra Club. A special guest that we have with us today is Beth Osborne, the Director of Transportation for America. And we have two local speakers as well. Dennis Grzinski is an environmental lawyer based in Milwaukee, and Jeremy Gregert is an Eau Claire City Council member. So we're so happy to have you here. Before we jump into our presentation, I also want to thank Peter Skopek with Wisberg and Greg May with 1000 Friends of Wisconsin, who are also members of the coalition who helped put together tonight's webinar. And without further ado, I introduce Beth Osborne with Transportation for America.
Thanks so much. Just to make sure folks know who we are, Transportation for America is a national nonprofit focused on connecting people to employment and services through multiple means of travel, no matter their financial capacity or physical ability. We do our work through research and analysis of the functioning of the current system, or often as we find the non-functioning of the current system, through policy advocacy and development, and through direct technical assistance. And we can just jump right in. I was invited to mainly talk about a report we just released, because so much of what we're working on is stymied by the notion that we need to handle or make investments that address congestion. And a lot of the belief, sometimes verbally spoken, sometimes just riding under the surface, is that traffic congestion happens because we haven't built enough highway or roadway capacity to deal with population growth. And so we tested that hypothesis, which is treated like biblical truth. And what we expected to find was that if that were true, areas that were growing more and building less would have the most congestion. Areas not growing that much and building more would have the least. What we found on a nationwide basis is we are building enough highway capacity, particularly the limited access freeways, to keep up with population growth. We're actually outstripping it. And this is over a period of 1993 to 2017. But as you can see, in spite of the fact that we built more freeway capacity than population growth, the congestion as measured by the Texas Transportation Institute as delay increased by an enormous amount nationwide. One does wonder exactly how much freeway capacity one has to build in order to reduce that number if outstripping population growth by 10% results in a 144% increase in delay. We also really struggled to find a pattern, except for everybody just has more congestion no matter what they do on their roadways. So let's go through that a second. You've got San Diego, California, which the highway folks would say, well, yeah, they have more congestion. They only built 22% more miles of freeway, and their population grew 26%. So apparently not keeping up by 4% with your population growth means 175% increase in congestion. In Nashville, they did keep up, and they had a 329% increase in congestion. You look at those numbers, and again, what increase in highway capacity would they need to reduce that number? I mean, I can't fathom the number of digits that would be required there. If we jump to the next slide, we've got kind of the other side of the spectrum. I believe that when we get to the next slide, we will see areas like Jackson, Mississippi, and Buffalo, New York. Sure enough, done this enough times now, I know. So Jackson, Mississippi had very little population growth and a lot of highway expansion, 317% increase in congestion. Buffalo, New York saw a 12% drop in their population and still added a little capacity, 175% increase in congestion. The only thing I can tell you is, of the cities we studied, which were the 100 largest areas by population, all of them had an increase in congestion. Not one of them even had a level set of congestion. The least congestion increased in any of the largest 100 urbanized areas was Detroit, which increased by 44%. So, and I like I said, I'd love to tell you there was a pattern. It was utter chaos. You know, you had an area like Brownsville, Texas, that I think had over a 70% increase in population growth, which is shocking. They also added something like 300% increase in highway miles, and they saw their congestion increase by 1,200%. So I think it is safe to say that the hypothesis is not true. Moving on to the next slide, we started looking for things that are true. One thing we find is, as we have built highways out into undeveloped areas, we have spread out development. And that has resulted in people driving more than they did on an individual basis, on a per capita basis. So you've got population growth, yes, but we're not only trying to keep up with population growth, we're trying to keep up with the fact that the way we construct our communities means every last one of us will always have to drive more next year than they had to drive the year before. And that is apparently our fate. Or in a lot of public policy makers' hands, they believe it is our fate. And it is part of a kind of reactive vision of community development and transportation development that we are subject to this, we have no control over it. There's real ramifications for this. This is a map that many of us urbanists have seen over the years, made by Cuyahoga County, which is the Cleveland area. And, you know, back in the late 40s, the population was concentrated up around the lake. And then over the next half century, they expanded throughout the county. Population didn't change. So the same number of people have to pay for, you know, what ends up being a little more than twice the number of roadways, twice the number of pipelines and everything, all the other infrastructure we need to do, the fire, the schools, the police, the garbage pickup. And what do they get for it? They get more time in congestion and longer trips. So basically, we have pioneered a way in the United States of America to make people pay twice as much to move half as fast and to have to go twice as far. And that is our gift to the world. Congestion is part of the problem. The issue is we are shooting at the wrong objective. We absolutely can manage these things better if we will actually shoot at the right goal. So why congestion is the wrong goal? It is a very numbers-based, you know, theoretical measure that looks at only one strip of roadway. It's not looking at the traveler's experience. And this little graphic shows you that the way we look at delay, the fact that you will have to take a longer trip when everybody's on the road than you would have to take if nobody was on the road, which is the concept of congestion, means that in Poughkeepsie, New York, where your average commute without traffic is longer than your average commute with traffic in New Orleans, the way we judge that is New Orleans is the failure. And Poughkeepsie's got it right. So, well, I go on to the next slide because I really think it captures what we're talking about. You know, on the right, we have a very congested corridor. If you are an elected official, I think you want to be the elected official over the area with all the commerce, not the area that has no traffic. But from a transportation perspective and the way transportation officials run things, the left is the success on an economic basis, because we judge transportation projects on how much time you will save. And the time is not from your origin to destination. It is between two observed spots on a length of highway. And so the way we measure traffic congestion is if you travel around in circles at the speed limit, that is an A+ system. That's the objective. That is exactly what we need. If you do stop and go traffic for 5 minutes and arrive, that's a failure that we need to spend money to fix, probably by taking up all the buildings in the way that cause the traffic. And that is the economic argument of highway expansion. If we move on to the next slide, we get into some of our policy recommendations. I haven't said it explicitly, but one of the things I'm trying to make clear is when you lay out your communities where everything you need to get to is really, really far away. Yeah, stay on the policy recommendations. Where if you lay out your communities where everything you need is really, really far away, you will have congestion. And as soon as you lay out your communities that way, you say, I don't care, because it can't be fixed once you've done it. End of story. So your land use is your fate. And if you lay out your communities that way, you're saying, I value being spread out and on the end of a road on a cul-de-sac more than I value my time and my trips. And that decision has been made. But I don't think most people really do feel that way. And a lot of this comes out of our development policies, which were actually created by the U.S. Department of Commerce in the early 1920s in response to the challenges of cities in the early days of industrialization. We had early industry polluting a lot. And we had overcrowded cities, and we had public health concerns that came out of it because we didn't have good sewer treatment and water treatment, things like that back then. So they tried to spread people out from each other, reduce the crowding, deal with separating them from the pollution. I would say that after 100 years, maybe, just maybe, it's time to revisit it, because it's possible our challenges are a little different now. And maybe we can look at a more traditional human development pattern, which we have had throughout human history since the creation of civilizations, where we cluster our needs so that you have a town center, just like most rural towns throughout America, where you have a lovely little town center where there's the government and there's the retail and there's public space. We could reorient our national transportation program around the concept of access, which I'm going to get into in a little bit. We could require transportation agencies stop favoring new roads over maintenance. We do, and I recommend that folks take a look at our repair priorities report, which I'll talk about in a minute, that shows that in spite of saying that fixing our crumbling roads and bridges is our top priority, that's not actually what gets the majority of transportation funds across the country. And in fact, if you want to build something and you already know you can't afford to maintain it while you're not maintaining your existing system, our state and our federal transportation programs are totally fine with that. We can make short trips walkable by making them safer. And the COVID-19 crisis has really shown us how important that is, and I'll talk about it more in a second. And we could remove restrictions on pricing to help manage driving demand. What's interesting is the value of time that we use to justify highway projects is based on the notion that people put a monetary value to their time. If people are not willing to pay to increase the speed of their trip and to reduce the time, then they place a value of nothing on time savings, and the entire justification for highway expansion, it falls apart. So that gives you a sense of what the Congestion Con report says. I did want to quickly run through some of our priorities and how all this fits together as an organization. Our first priority is a fix-it-first approach. I remember being at USDOT on the Credit Council overseeing TIFIA loans and rail loans and things like that. And we would get projects from across the country. I particularly remember a project in Ohio and a project in Texas where they wanted to take out debt to build a road that they didn't anticipate would have much traffic on it. They did think it would spur development further away from city cores. And they did not have a plan to operate and maintain that roadway, but they were also not operating and maintaining their existing roadway. And the way Congress wrote the program, we had to give them the money. On the transit side, if you want to build something new, you have to come in and show that you meet certain national priorities, that you have a funding system to pay to operate and maintain that asset, and you have a plan to maintain that asset while maintaining and operating the rest of your system. We'd like to see that on the roadway side as well. If you jump on to the next slide, and I will, again, give it a little plug for repair priorities, which is on our website. Designing for safety over speed. If you have been paying attention to the press lately, one of the things you will see is all of the reporting on exactly how speed has taken over our roadways. It looks like one of our best, if not really only, precautions against speeding has been traffic congestion. There was a story in the Washington Post that was saying that the corona pandemic has emptied America's roadways and speeders have taken over, that police saw an uptake in speeding and fatal crashes. In Connecticut, traffic is down, fatal crashes are up 40%. I just saw a report that said nationwide traffic was down in the month of March by about 18%, but fatalities were up by double that. And you can just see it literally all over the country. People are going too fast. It's because we design our roadways to go too fast. And without traffic congestion, the design is screaming at the driver to go faster. Then we wonder why people want to drive. Maybe it's because they don't like speeding cars speeding right at them. So this has been a huge priority of my organization. Moving on, the third one is connecting people to jobs and services. This is something that comes out of 15 years of work by the folks in my organization from multiple jobs before we all came together in this one, where we would do direct technical assistance with transportation agencies, and we would run into engineers on a regular basis who would say, we absolutely get what you're talking about. We really want to design our roads differently. We want to support the priorities that your organization talks about, being able to get out and walk around, being able to support local economic development, because we agree that cars speeding through a community, they're not really good window shoppers. The small businesses do better with people walking past their establishment. We want to support good open space and things like that. But how do I engineer to address things like household transportation costs or walkability? What is the number I base my design on? And that is a really fair question. We often in the transportation modernization advocacy talk like planners and not like engineers. And so we really went to work on how to make this into an engineering approach, an engineering standard. And it actually started with work out of Wisconsin by the University of Wisconsin and my partners at the State Smart Transportation Initiative, working with folks in Virginia, with the Virginia DOT, that wanted to measure access to jobs. You will probably recognize this map. I think you all have probably seen it before. And this was one of the first places we tested out utilizing a lot of the data that you hold in the palm of your hand when you're using a smartphone. Back in the 1950s, a lot of academics wrote about how the gold standard of measuring transportation systems and how successful they are is measuring whether or not people can access important destinations like jobs, groceries, banks, schools, healthcare, childcare, public parks, things like that. But to do that in the 1950s would have been calculating each trip individually, which was an overwhelming task. Well, fast forward half a century, and we walk around with all that data, right here in our hands, in our phones, and we can put that to work here. And that's basically what we've done. We've taken a GIS system, we have overlaid it with where jobs are, where points of interest are, which is just an overlay that you purchase. And we put in the transportation system, the map, the roadways. We put in the GTFS feed, which shows where transit's going and when it's scheduled for. And we have some proxies for walkability. It's not just about and bikeability. It's not just about where the sidewalks and the bike lanes are. It has to do with the characteristics of the roadway. For example, if you, like so many parts of the country, have striped a 3-foot bike lane next to 60-mile-per-hour traffic, we don't recognize that bike lane, and nor should any transportation professional. They should be embarrassed by doing that. Sadly, they rarely are. But there are plenty of places where there's no bike lane that's 100% bikeable, including my own street. So we use that. We then go down to the census block level, and we calculate every possible trip, and we aggregate it together. And you can get a lovely heat map like this, which planners and public policy people love and engineers hate. The engineers get a beautiful spreadsheet that goes behind this and helps them actually do their work. But this shows you that access to jobs by automobile in the morning is pretty ubiquitous. You can get almost anywhere in the region to all the jobs you could possibly want in the Madison, Wisconsin area. If you jump to the next one, it shows you transit. Not as good, but not a lot of surprises here. The downtown, the historic area, the gridded area, has the best access. Not a big shock. The distances aren't big. It probably has the best transit service. And what's interesting here is those two are the access to jobs measure, which most people get super excited about, and the transportation engineers are obsessed about. Your trip to work is only 20% of your trips. It's probably 30% of your VMT because it's a longer trip than everything else. So let's look at something, the next map, that shows you access to everything else overlaid with poverty. It's a rich map. It tells you a lot. It shows that you don't have to be downtown to have good access, because you can live in kind of traditional little walkable communities out of the downtown. It also shows you, with the suburbanization of poverty, where a transit system may need to be updated. It shows you where, as poor people move to the suburbs, they're forced to go into rather dangerous, inaccessible circumstances to get where they need to go. And what is fascinating about using this measure is that it correlates beautifully with how much you spend on transportation, with how many cars you need to own, with how much you drive. It's this one, it's access to services. It's not as much the access to jobs. Public policy outcomes, active movement during the week. I could just go through all of the greenhouse gas emissions, all of the what has been considered squishy outcome policy, non-hard transportation, all of it correlates with this one measure. And so this is something we've gotten really excited about. We're working with folks on Capitol Hill to include in the federal transportation program as the measure of whether or not the transportation system is doing what it should do, which is connecting people, whether they can drive or not, with the things that they need. I might have one more slide. I no longer, yes, this is to brag on Virginia, which has done this. They are quantifying all new capacity projects based on how well they connect people to jobs. There's a breakout measure for how well they connect low-income people to jobs. And their land use measure, the measure they were asked to come up with was the connection between transportation and land use. And they use the access to services measure as that part of the score. Every single project they consider gets these scores along with a congestion mitigation score and a safety and environment and economic development, depending on what part of the state you're in. There's more emphasis put on certain areas than others. If you're in Southwestern Virginia, congestion would be the greatest thing that could ever happen to the region because it would mean you have an economy. You have to be a little bit privileged to get upset about the congestion. It means that there are people with places to go. But up in Northern Virginia, they put a lot more focus on congestion. But everyone gets a score on this, and it determines what gets funded. So this is something we're hoping to see at the federal level. It is an infinitely doable project. It's so easily quantified now. And like I said, it correlates with all the things we care about. The beauty is, instead of the only solution to congestion being expanding roadways, the solution to lack of accessibility could be speeding up a car trip, maybe bridging a rail bed or dealing with a bottleneck. It could be a transit solution, and it's easy to compare these on the same level. It could be expansion of transit, more frequency, changing a route. It can be a bike ped solution. It can also be a land use solution. And a lot of times what you will find is you provide better access by moving the things people need closer to them than speeding up the travel to where it is if it's far away. And even if you subsidize that, it's way cheaper and you get a way bigger bang for your buck. So these are our priorities. These are the things we're trying to pull folks into, and hope that if we can get people talking about transportation in this way, we get out of the same argument we've been having for decades. And I think with that, I'm done. I am. You can get more information. Our former webinar about this is online, and I beg you to go to our website, check out all our fun reports and work.
Great, thank you so much, Beth. Next, we have environmental lawyer Dennis Grzinski talking about how some of these things show up locally and specifically in Milwaukee.
Hello, folks. In an earlier time, the Milwaukee area was blessed with a really robust public transit system. Streetcars connected essentially all of the developed areas of Milwaukee County, and commuter rail connected Milwaukee with outlying communities to the south, southeast, west, and north, including over 100-mile-per-hour service out to the Oconomowoc-Pewaukee area in Waukesha County. But that was an earlier age. By the 1960s, automobile use had flourished and transit ridership had declined. Streetcars were replaced by trackless trolleys and then by buses, and routes and service declined. Highways, and then the interstate highway system in particular, led to the complete demise of commuter rail. By the turn of the century, these no longer new interstate highways needed rebuilding. And the tug of war between funding of highway expansion and continued support or improvement of public transit was in full force. The short story is that billions of dollars for highway expansion leaves little money, if any, for transit. What happened? First, about $800 million was spent rebuilding and adding lanes to the Marquette interchange in downtown Milwaukee, where Interstate I-43 and I-94 connect, about where the large print Milwaukee appears on the map. Then over $1.5 billion was committed to rebuilding and adding lanes to I-94 south of Milwaukee, from the airport all the way down to the Illinois border to the south. Then the third was another $1.7 billion committed to rebuilding and adding lanes to the Zoo interchange, circled there with the reference on the map, Zoo, the busiest interchange in Wisconsin on the west side of Milwaukee and in Wauwatosa. Each of these projects was designed to cut a few minutes from rush hour commute travel times from outlying suburbs to downtown and to reduce congestion. Meanwhile, state funding for transit had stagnated, and with inflation every year, its purchasing power was simply reduced. After 2010, Governor Walker cut transit funding by 10%, resulting in serious system cuts and fares that were among the highest in the nation. The result was litigation. MICA, Milwaukee Intercity Congregations Allied for Hope, a coalition of social justice religious congregations, and the Black Health Coalition of Wisconsin, represented by attorney Karen Rotker at the ACLU of Wisconsin, and by me, then I was at Midwest Environmental Advocates, sued the state and the federal transportation agencies, challenging the environmental impact statement for the Zoo interchange project as inadequate under federal law. Specifically, first, for failure to consider any alternative to the project, which included a public transit component. Second, for inadequately evaluating the air pollution impacts of the project. And third, for failure to evaluate the socioeconomic impacts of the project, together with other highway expansions on suburban sprawl and the resulting suburban decline. The complaint highlighted the disproportionate reliance on transit of Milwaukee's communities of color and those with disabilities, since they disproportionately lack private autos and driver's licenses. In 2013, a federal court decision basically upheld several of the plaintiff's claims and scheduled a hearing to determine what remedies to impose. Mediation followed with a settlement providing $13.5 million to fund bus lines connecting Milwaukee's north side African-American neighborhoods with Waukesha County job sites, and those bus routes and bus lines ran for about 4 years. CMRT, the Coalition for More Responsible Transportation, was advocating for transit and against highway expansion during the Zoo project decision-making, and it continued to grow and strengthen and broaden over the years. It then vigorously opposed the state's next decision to spend about another $1 billion rebuilding and adding lanes to that 3.5-mile east-west stretch of I-94 between the Marquette and Zoo interchanges, referred to as the I-94 east-west on the east-west oblong on the map. So litigation round 2, what happened? MICA was a plaintiff again. It was joined by the NAACP Milwaukee branch and the Sierra Club John Muir chapter. They sued with the same attorneys as in the Zoo case, and this time the clients prevailed without any court decision. Between the effective public advocacy by the many members of CMRT and the strong legal challenges that were basically very similar to the challenges raised in the Zoo case, the state DOT backed down and ended up requesting the federal government to vacate or undo the decision approving the planned project. So that, another almost $1 billion has not been spent. The project is, I can't say dead. I would say it's asleep or slumbering or in limbo. And all sensible, responsible transportation advocates need to remain vigilant to do everything that we can to prevent oodles and oodles of additional money being spent on another expansion project that, as we've just heard, is not likely to reduce congestion, is simply likely to add to more sprawl and a less efficient urban area. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dennis. And then finally, Jeremy Gregor, City Council member in Eau Claire.
Yeah, thank you, Cassie. Yeah, thanks for having me here. Appreciate the other presentations. So I serve on the City Council in Eau Claire, but also on our city's Transit Commission and our Plan Commission. So I have a lot of input on our long-term changes. Also serve in advocacy roles in the nonprofit community and with the Chippewa Valley Transit Alliance, which is a member of CMRT, the Coalition for More Responsible Transportation. And I'm president of Bike Chippewa Valley and a Sierra Club member. So try to be pretty involved. Our city in West Central Wisconsin, Eau Claire, is about 70,000 people. And what you're seeing on the screen right now, it's kind of the larger urbanized area on the southern end of this metropolitan area map. And Chippewa Falls is on the north. That whole area that you're seeing is about 130,000 people, but you can see that in red, the very extensive highway system for such a small population. It's basically pretty similar in terms of highways as what you'll find in Madison, which is an area about 5 times bigger in population. So it's really been overbuilt, in my opinion, and it ultimately results in almost zero congestion, which is sort of a different story than what's been told, mostly just because we have a very small population. So essentially, I see it as an opportunity for us to kind of refocus on what is really important to people in the community, and that's being able to make sure that everyone in our community has access to transportation. And we could go to the next slide and zoom into Eau Claire. You can kind of see the way that highway system really impacts the landscape and really has more of a barrier quality to it for the people that actually live there, where someone like myself who lives without a car, car free my whole life, I look at the city in a different way. And in a lot of these freeways that kind of are in the very outskirts, and then the state highways that are within that, those have been kind of built up over the years, since the 1950s. They keep having to bypass each other, essentially. Like, you always hear the term, we're building a bypass for this. Like, usually it's for a downtown, so you kind of strip the downtown of a lot of travelers that are maybe heading up north, from Madison to Lake Country or something, or maybe a traveler on I-94 between Chicago and the Twin Cities. That's none of those vehicles go through our town anymore, really, and then maybe people will stop at the Quick Trip or something. So it really kind of takes something away where a lot of people have never been to Eau Claire because they've just driven by. And so living there, I get around, actually relatively effectively by bicycle and walking. Our transit system, though, has not expanded since the 1990s when the university joined as a partner to make it so that student fees would go toward making transit free for all students after they pay their annual fee. But kind of what we're seeing here is really a lot of what's bringing us a lot of challenge in terms of, our transit system being able to go through the city in more of a grid pattern as opposed to, unfortunately, when you have all these additional barriers, like the rivers and the hills, since we're on the northern edge of the driftless region, are some barriers to transit, but these highways are even worse. So I guess some things, so essentially, since we built that up so much, we've really stepped away from other things that we've been able to do historically. Like we had a streetcar system that went to Chippewa Falls and throughout our city. And that was in the 1890s, and it was an electric heated streetcar system, the first heated one in the world. But we got rid of that with buses and cars. We even had a bike trail that connected up to Chippewa Falls from Eau Claire, which is about 12 miles. And that was created by a bicycle club. But that kind of disappeared in the early 20th century. And now just this summer, we're completing that bike trail again after, incrementally building it out. And, the state does have certain programs like the Transportation Alternatives Program that is helpful for that type of thing. But really the amount of money that program gets is just tiny. We really need to advocate to expand that. There was a bus that connected Eau Claire to Chippewa Falls by the 1940s when the streetcar line was shut down, but that was discontinued in the 1980s. So really a lot of this big highway expansion that we see right here, our Chamber of Commerce has been a big advocate for expanding highways, and this bypass, actually you can zoom in or go to the next slide actually. And you can see on the far right is the latest bypass of the downtown. That was about 2006. And that's something that was about $500 million. So it's not just the big cities that are getting these mega projects. And then the highway you're seeing north and south, kind of in the middle, was the bypass from the 1950s. And then you see the downtown on the left. What we found is that the Department of Transportation, and actually, when you have the cursor over downtown, you can see that there's a little bit of there's one road that goes north and south that's pretty wide. That was kind of the original bypass of the downtown because it was just one block to the east of where most of the businesses were. And that bridge crossing the Eau Claire River, that one right there, actually didn't exist until they built that in the 1950s as a way to bypass all the businesses downtown. And so there's really hardly any buildings along that because it's basically a bypass. What we found is that when the state builds a new bypass, they try to turn the old street over, the old highway over to the city to then pay for the maintenance and then also replace in the future. So who knows, maybe this bypass that was built in 2006 on the far right will be bypassed again, in like 50 years, but hopefully we can kind of turn the tide. And that's a big focus of what I'm trying to do on the city council, is really focus on bikeability, walkability, connectivity for people of all ages, incomes, and abilities. So just one more slide here to show how out of control it can get even in a small place. Another case of this is between Eau Claire and Chippewa Falls. The highway to the east and west is the one between Green Bay and the Twin Cities, essentially. These interchanges are just not habitable places. You don't really actually see people or business or like housing in these areas. There's a Walmart kind of in the center, but that's about what you're gonna get. And but those three layers of bypass you can see going north and south, where it just wasn't good enough you know, to be able to go 55, you have to go 65, and then you have to go 75. That's the miles an hour. So um, that's what can happen even in a small city. So I thought I'd share that with you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for those great presentations. I'm Peter Skopek. I'm the director at WISPERG. I'm just going to summarize quickly what we heard, and then we're going to head into Q&A here. We've been getting lots of really great questions from the audience here, so I want to make sure we can get to as many of those as we can. So we heard from Beth about how Transportation for America has been showing that that congestion really is the wrong goal, the wrong thing to be looking at as we're thinking about transportation. What the impacts on our transportation policy are when all we really think about is how to reduce congestion as much as possible. It doesn't account for what people's lived experience is in a transportation system that really only measures congestion and congestion reduction, doesn't take into account the quality of life in our communities, the economic vibrancy in those communities. I think that ties back into what Jeremy was just saying here as well. We heard about the importance of designing our transportation system for people, designing our transportation system to give people access to the places that they want to go, and how that really is a much more important priority than just thinking about how can we cut congestion, so car traffic down as much as possible. We heard from Beth about Transportation for America's 3 priorities, and we'll be sharing these around after the webinar here as well. They're on Transportation for America's website. They're quite familiar to a lot of people in this coalition. It's things that we've been advocating for a while as well. So prioritizing maintenance of existing infrastructure before thinking about building new roads and new infrastructure, designing for safety over designing for speed. And then third, connecting people to jobs and services, again, thinking about access to the places that we really want to go through our transportation system. And then we heard 2 really interesting presentations from Dennis and from Jeremy about the really important organizing that's happening and that has happened, the legal action that's happened. We heard about how Eau Claire is apparently the city of bypasses. That was fascinating. You have more bypasses than people, it seems like, Jeremy. So we heard what the impacts are of a transportation policy that really only thinks about how to reduce congestion rather than thinking about how to create a transportation system that really works for people in those communities, what the impacts are on equity in our communities, on the environment, on quality of life in those places as well. So thank you for the great presentations. We have some excellent questions that we're going to get to here. So the first question that I wanted to address was on how it happens that we end up with this kind of transportation policy. So a lot of transportation policy makers and planners are well-trained, they have good intentions, they maybe know some of these things. Where is the breakdown? How do we end up with a transportation system that is so flawed in many ways? And Beth, maybe can I go to you for that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, how long do you have? I mean, I think the simple answer is that our federal transportation program, which has come to dominate all levels of government and the way they handle transportation, was created in the 1950s by very smart people who were asked to do something that had never been done in this country before and really hadn't been done in most parts of the world before. Remember, it comes out of President Eisenhower, who as general had been very impressed by the German Autobahn system and wanted to create something like that here, both to connect cities, but also to allow, for better national defense by being able to move troops across the country because they were still planning for the kind of war that we had in World War II. They didn't know how to do this. So some smart engineers said, I'm not quite sure how to do this. Let's write some things down and try it. And we will learn from it. And the program will grow and develop, which is a good idea. The problem is we didn't learn from it. We wrote it down, it became biblical. And it's what we've done since 1956. Not because we knew it was right, but because someone wrote it down on a piece of paper, so it has to be followed now. And to this day, some random numbers that was put down on a page as a starting place has become the rule. And it's buried, it's not even in the law, it's buried all through our program, and in design standards and in procedures and scoping manuals and things like that. And the problem is, as the federal government became a bigger player in the overall building of the transportation system, those rules kind of leaked out, became the basis of most state DOT systems. And because most local governments rely on their state DOTs to be supportive, have for the most part conformed to that as well. So basically the standards to develop the Autobahn of the United States has become the standards we use to build every single roadway at every single level of government. And that is a problem. On top of which, the way we build our communities, like I said, in terms of development, really make those roads important, because when you put everything you need super far away, the only way to make it more convenient is to allow you to drive like a bat out of hell.
Great, thank you. Let's go to the next question. Jeremy, maybe I'm going to ask you this one. We got a few questions in advance and also in the Q&A about rail and kind of what the importance would be of having a rail system that might connect places like Eau Claire to the Twin Cities and to Madison, to Chicago, to other places in Wisconsin. I think that's an issue that you've worked on. Can you talk a little bit about that and why you think that's important?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Peter. Thanks for those questions. Yeah, we had rail service through Eau Claire until about 1962 that connected, well, the primary line was the 400, which could do 400 miles in 400 minutes between the Twin Cities and Chicago. And it had a stop in Eau Claire. And currently there is a Union Pacific owned rail line that still exists along most of this route and has, goes right through downtown Eau Claire, right by where the station was torn down in the 1980s. So there is, infrastructure, luckily, here and across the country, really, that still has capacity. The Union Pacific line is just a freight rail line, but there's, especially with the decline of the frac sand industry, it really doesn't have much traffic on it, and is probably a lot more viable and faster route between Chicago and Milwaukee and the Twin Cities than the river route that goes through La Crosse and the Empire Builder currently uses. So there is a lot of talk about, expanding, particularly to the Twin Cities from Eau Claire, because politically it's easier to work with Minnesota because they're a bit, the politics there are a bit more conducive to rail planning and toward, investment. And so obviously some sort of partnership. I think where Wisconsin is placed is great because we have, states like Minnesota and Illinois that are kind of bookending us, that can really help us, if we were to get on board politically, connect up to a lot of places. So I think that's an important point, is that is something that would help like communities across the state. And Eau Claire is luckily well positioned. And they were actually looking at a public-private partnership rather than relying on Amtrak, unfortunately, to be able to provide future service at this point. So does that answer the question?
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jeremy. So one broader question here that kind of ties into a conversation that we had on our last webinar as well, that got into cultural issues and car culture in general. So we talked a little bit about how highway expansions and this the prioritizing of reducing congestion, which leads to more investment in roadways, not enough investment in things like public transportation, walking and biking infrastructure, communities that are designed to let people get around in ways that don't involve getting in a car. How those things are often in competition. I think one important aspect of these types of investments as well is that if we build out highway infrastructure, and driving infrastructure, it reinforces people's behavior as well to drive. So I wonder if anyone could talk about that a little bit, just how investing in driving infrastructure at the expense of basically everything else, how, as the way we've done in many communities in Wisconsin and across the country, is undermining and reinforcing car culture as well.
I'm certainly happy to jump in there. You can only use the transportation options that exist. I know that that sounds obvious. That is totally unclear to a lot of people in public policy. I think about when I was living in Baton Rouge. New Orleans is my hometown. I went to school in Baton Rouge. Go Tigers. And when I was there, I needed to find a job, but I could not find a job I could get to outside of a car. I tried to bike to a couple of places 2 times, decided I did not enjoy putting my life on the line. Public policy makers in Louisiana would tell you I chose not to bike. An interesting choice of words. And my brother, who lives in the area now, lives 3 blocks away from a grocery store that to get to outside of a car, you would only have to walk or bike in 45-mile-per-hour truck traffic or walk in a drainage ditch. The people of Louisiana would tell you that he chose to drive there. Again, interesting approach. We kind of have to show folks the fact that they are not providing them. And that's why I like the accessibility lens so much, is it shows how the system is actually not connected, and it's particularly poorly connected for those who can't afford a car. And through this crisis, remember, before the COVID crisis, there were a lot of statistics about how many millions of American households were $400 away from an economic collapse. Well, guess what? They're in it now. And they no longer, they probably didn't before, but they definitely don't now have the money to pay for 1 car per adult in every household in order for everybody to get around. So if we value economic recovery, then we want people to be economically productive. When I was in Baton Rouge and I couldn't get to a job without a car, but I couldn't afford a car because I didn't have a job, it was the country telling me that my labor and my creativity was not welcome in the economy if I couldn't pay a cover charge. We cannot afford that. It was bad enough when it happened to me, and when it's been happening to people in the past. We cannot afford to have that attitude with the tens of millions of unemployed people in this country now. We need them to go back to work for our economy to function. That's a story we can tell, and it loops back to the question that the last person who asked the question about how we got here. We don't give people the right things to measure. If we value and we quantify the things we care about and have our DOTs design their projects to that end, as opposed to only putting those objectives in our plans and not in the project development and not in the project prioritization process, we could see a different investment package. So we need to make accessibility that measure. That's going to capture the walking and biking. We need to make public health outcomes, environmental outcomes, part of the measures we're designing to.
Great, thank you, Beth. Dennis, were you about to weigh in on this as well, or?
Yes, I was. It's really important to understand that our Regional Planning Commission for the southeastern part of Wisconsin has come up with wonderful plans for recommended expansion of transit. They lay out the case incredibly clearly that the public transit system that serves the 7-county area that's centered around Milwaukee needs to be expanded 100%. The extent of the system and the services that it provides, basically for the well-being of our economy, for the quality of life, to support appropriate development in the region, needs to be doubled. Unfortunately, they also recognize that our funding system is just completely inappropriate and crazy and insufficient, because it provides billions and billions and billions for essentially highway building, expansion, adding highways, a lot of money, but not enough to maintain the highways that we have, and then dribs and drabs for transit. And it's a world in which the planners have great ideas, wonderful recommendations, but the transportation builders and deciders, both in our transportation departments and more importantly, in our legislature, are in a different world where what's important to them is more highways. Part of it, of course, is that The road builders lobby is really the second most effective lobbying entity in this state, second only to the Tavern Owners Association. It's that part of the political system that's a big part of the problem.
Yeah, I can address this
Okay.
a bit too if there's time.
Sure, if you have a quick response, and then we can get to just a couple more questions. We're almost out of time here.
Sure, I
Thanks,
just
Jeremy.
I think the local level is certainly a place that can make a difference and change some of the priorities. Our strategic plan for the city of Eau Claire has an element focused on reducing automobile dependency that I was able to add in there. And we also, as a city, have committed to 100% renewable energy and carbon neutrality by the year 2050, hopefully before that. So there's ways to kind of set these big goals that you can look at every single piece of your spending, and really judge it based on your strategic plan. So that's just something that to keep in mind where, our city has, more miles of bicycle trail than any other city outside of Madison in the state. And we got there because we had a vision for that 30 years ago. And we can start planning ahead. So, and apparently they also had a big plans for highways too at that time, and 30 years before that. So we got here because we decided that was a priority, and we can change what those priorities are. So
Great. Thanks, Jeremy. I want to get to maybe two more related questions here. Beth, you mentioned this a little bit, but obviously this is something that's on a lot of people's minds, which is what is this current pandemic going to do to our transportation priorities and to public transportation as well. We had someone from Wausau up in northern central Wisconsin ask, how can we continue to demonstrate that transit is essential, it has a value, it's important to many communities, including right now during this pandemic, although ridership is down, people are noticing buses that are running empty. How can we make sure to continue to emphasize that transit is important and make sure that that transit systems come out of this crisis still being able to function?
Well, I'm going to start with good news, go to bad news, and return to good news. Good news is I think that case has been rather effectively made because of the crisis. COVID-19 has shone a light on many of the flaws with the transportation system that were always there, but are easier to see for people that don't obsess about transportation now. And it's really kind of laying bare what we've done wrong. On transit, I remember the day, it was March 9th. I'm reading the Washington Post. I'm reading how the Trump administration is considering sending all federal workers home. And it occurs to me, because I'm riding a WMATA bus at the time, that, wow, every time government has closed down before, it's been a disaster for transit, obviously. But this is even bigger. This is going to be a much bigger shutdown if the mayor shuts down the city. And then it occurred to me, heck, this has got to be roiling New York City right now and Seattle. And I reached out to my friends at MTA and Seattle Transit and discovered that, yes, they were in disastrous financial conditions because of the shutdown of the economy. And that was likely what was coming. So I started calling around on Capitol Hill to see who was considering propping up transit. The answer was no one. They were thinking of doing a 2009 style Recovery Act to build more transit while no one could afford to operate the existing transit. But when it was pointed out to them that not only was that not a good idea, that we needed to sustain what we had and we needed a robust transit system to help the economy return, when we pointed out that the huge number of essential workers that rely on transit, thanks to an analysis done by Transit Center, people got it, and they got it quickly. They got the notion that it's not about those of us who can drive and those who are transit dependent. It's actually about, even if I drive myself to the hospital and my nurses and techs can't get there to take care of me, that actually makes me transit dependent. And that really got through in a way it never has before. We had support from the Senate and the House, from Republicans and Democrats. We had champions on all sides of the aisle, people who consider themselves representing rural areas and urban areas. That is a big turnaround, and there's great opportunity here. I will say it is not helped by the boneheaded move of the CDC today that put out a recommendation reported on by the New York Times that employers should encourage single occupancy travel and to keep people out of any kind of shared mode of travel. I'm so befuddled by the recommendation. I cannot speak clearly to it yet. Talk to me tomorrow. Maybe I will have calmed down right now. I'm just, when I try to figure out where to start to talk about how ridiculously stupid that is, I don't know where. And as someone who had a kidney transplant last year, I have experienced this with public health and medical officials who cannot compare risk at all. But we're going to have to deal with that. That's the bad news. Here's some more good news. This is an earth-changing event, and areas all over the country are rising to that. We have cities across the country redesigning roadways on the fly, shutting down roadways to travel, and discovering not only that it works pretty well, but that people really, really like it. And a lot of them are planning to keep roads closed on a permanent basis. This goes from bigger cities like New York City and Oakland and places like that to much smaller ones like Burlington, Vermont, and Louisville, Kentucky, and Grand Rapids, Michigan. And that opens up a lot. I think it opens up two things: the notion that we can redesign the roadway quickly and make more space for people going forward. The other thing is maybe in transportation, we can involve the public in these decisions by some temporary changes that they can interact with, which is a great way to make people more excited and accepting of a change. Right now, what we do is we write a pretty little sketch on a piece of paper, we hand it to the public, and we say, I want you to look at this sketch, I want you to close your eyes and go into a total recall style virtual reality, walk through and tell me what it will be like for you. And then we will consider your comments, versus going in and making some temporary changes and letting people touch and feel it and give you real feedback. We should do transportation like that forever. And so there's great opportunity coming out of this. And a lot of our case is being made just by the circumstances of the day. I recommend telling stories as much as humanly possible. And to the extent that you can send stories my way, we are collecting stories of transit users, of people who rely on walking and biking, on people who don't want to go to a world where every place they have to travel requires everybody over 16 to have their own car. Please send those stories my way. We're compiling them. We're talking with folks on Capitol Hill. We're talking with folks in states. And I think that, frankly, it's those stories and anecdotes that are going to help bolster what's already happening naturally.
Great, thank you, Beth. That's a great and very compelling response. And we'll have contact information for Transportation for America up in just a moment. Last question I wanted to ask, and we're over time here already, but just to end on a positive note. You mentioned a few cities that are taking positive action right now in response to COVID-19 and providing more space to people. At a larger scale, are there any communities, any U.S. cities that are or states that are pursuing access or people-oriented transportation that you've come across, Beth?
Well, I already mentioned Virginia DOT that is using access as one of their primary measures of the success of the transportation system. We're working with the state of Massachusetts to use access more. We've done some analysis using access for the state of Washington. The Utah legislature passed legislation requiring Utah DOT to use access as a measure. They're trying to figure out how to do that now. We've worked with the state of Hawaii on this as well. And the response has been great on Capitol Hill. There's been several bills introduced to make this a part of the transportation program. And we may find out as early as Monday whether or not it's made it into the House Transportation Reauthorization Bill. I think this really has momentum. For one thing, how can you be against better access to jobs? Real hard position to take. And there is so much that's more human about that way of that lens of looking at the transportation system, that when you compare that against the concept of delay or level of service, which sounds like gobbledygook, we kind of win on just the language alone, much less the concept. So yes, we're hearing a lot of excitement around it. What is concerning people is teaching folks how to do things differently, and more the procedural challenge of resetting your program. And so I think that's going to be the big challenge.
Great. And I think this is a good place to end. I'm going to ask James for just a moment to pull up the last slide, just so we can make sure to have everyone's contact information up here and some information on how to get involved in the coalition if you'd like to get more involved, or if this is your first event involving the coalition. So we'll see that in just a moment. And while James pulls this up, I just want to say thank you again to all of our really great speakers. Thank you, Beth, for being so generous with your time and answering many questions. Thanks to everyone for submitting really great questions to all of our panelists. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Jeremy, for providing really good local perspective here. So if you'd like to get more involved with the work that the coalition is doing, please feel free to reach out to Cassie. That's cassandra.steiner@sierraclub.org. You're also welcome to email me. I'm just peter@wispurg.org, and we can get you involved in the coalition. We have the contact information up here for Transportation for America as well. So as Beth said, Transportation for America is looking for stories of people who rely on transit, on walking and biking to get around. So you can email info@T4, that's the number 4, america.org, and T4America.org is also the website with really great resources and the Congestion Con report and recommendations that the organization has. And then we also have contact information for Dennis and for Jeremy up here. We'll send this around afterwards as well. DennisGlaw@gmail.com if you'd like to get in touch with Dennis, and Jeremy.Greigert, GRAGERT @ECCitycouncil.com. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. This was a great discussion. We're really excited that you all joined us, and I hope you stay safe and have a good night. Thanks, everyone.